Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. We're digging into the U.S. and China today. It's the world's most crucial economic relationship, but also arguably the most volatile one. And there was that big meeting recently, October 30th, President Trump and China's top leader out at a South Korean airbase. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much genuine stability can one meeting, even a high-stakes one, actually secure here? I mean, it came after months of really intense back and forth. The article called it haggling, bluffing, and fist-shaking. And now we have this object, apparent truce. Markets certainly breathed a sigh of relief, but we need to probe a bit deeper. Is this really a grand bargain, a path back to something more normal? Or is it more like a grand bazaar, just swapping some short-term fixes for political breathing room?
That difference is absolutely critical. And that's really our focus today, getting past that initial wave of relief, which you saw everywhere, and really taking a hard look at the details. What are the actual mechanisms for de-escalation? How solid is this agreement likely to be? And maybe the most important part, what about those deeper issues, the structural problems, especially around tech and industrial strategy that were sort of deliberately sidelined? Because, if you're making decisions about investment, about supply chains long term, understanding what wasn't fixed is probably more critical than celebrating the bits that were temporarily patched up.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's start with the basics then. The things that were agreed, the bits that calmed the markets down. What exactly got trimmed back?
Right. The immediate wins were definitely focused on the most visible kind of disruptive threats, tactical stuff. And probably the biggest one was related to those critical supply chains. I'm talking about rare earths.
Yes, the rare earth delay. That was prominent. China said it'll hold off on new export restrictions for a year. That's pretty significant, isn't it, given how vital those materials are?
It's huge. They go into everything, like electric vehicles, advanced weapon systems, you name it. The mere possibility of losing access, that was a major, major risk factor hanging over multiple industries.
So delaying that threat for a year provides some breathing room.
Exactly. And it wasn't just China giving something away, it was reciprocal. Their move on rare earth happened just as the U.S. backed off a potential massive 100% tariff threat they apparently had ready for November 1st. So you see that immediate tit for tat. One side pulls back from a big stick, the other guarantees a crucial flow of goods. It's like hitting pause simultaneously.
Okay, and there were actual tariff cuts too, right? Not just pausing new ones.
Yes, some trimming. Specifically, the U.S. cut a 20% tariff in half, down to 10%. This was the one linked to China's alleged role in not stopping fentanyl precursor chemicals.
And China, in return, committed to doing more to crack down on that trade.
That was the deal, yes. And looking forward, there was also a big pause on future planned escalations. The U.S. agreed to postpone, again for a year, some reciprocal tariffs that were scheduled for November 10th. And importantly, this pause also covered those potentially really damaging new export controls, the ones targeting subsidiaries that are 50% or more owned by already restricted Chinese companies. That rule, if it went ahead, could have hit a huge number of firms.
Right. And then there's the more political stuff, the signals. Soybeans.
Soybeans, exactly. China started buying American soybeans again after stopping back in May. That's always a very visible gesture, especially, for U.S. agricultural states. And both sides agreed generally to boost farm trade.
Plus, a little relief for the shippers. The port fees.
Yeah, they suspended those tit-for-tat shipping levies and port fees for a year, too. Helped smooth out some of the cost uncertainty in global logistics, which has been, frankly, a nightmare.
So, okay, put it all together. Definitely sounds like a de-escalation package.
Yeah.
Things got less tense.
Without a doubt. It effectively lowered the temperature. But, and this is the really crucial context, we absolutely cannot call this a reset. It's a truce. It's not a repeal of the underlying hostile environment.
Explain that. What does that mean, hostile environment? What's the baseline still look like for companies trading between the U.S. and China?
Well, even after these cuts and pauses, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods is still incredibly high. It's sitting at about 47%.
47%. Wow.
Yeah. Now, that is down from 57%, which isn't nothing, but 47% is still fundamentally punitive. Just think, before this whole trade conflict kicked off, average tariffs were way, way lower, single digits often.
Okay.
And meanwhile, China's keeping its existing average tariff at around 10%. So yes, markets felt relief because things stopped getting worse and maybe got slightly better. But the day-to-day reality is still one of, let's call it managed friction at a really elevated level.
Managed friction. I like that term. And that friction, that high baseline, brings us straight to the messy parts, right? The ambiguities, the things left out. If it was a grand bazaar, what didn't get sold?
Precisely. And the lack of immediate, concrete follow-through on some of these promises, that's creating real risk for businesses right now.
Let's dig into that ambiguity. You mentioned the export controls earlier, that 50% affiliates rule affecting subsidiaries. China's Commerce Ministry said the U.S. agreed to pause it for a year.
Right. They reported it as agreed.
But sources are pointing out there's actually, well, there's no formal notice from the U.S. side about this pause. What's the practical difference? Why does that matter to a CEO?
It matters immensely because a CEO or their legal team can't base million-dollar decisions on a press release from another country's ministry or even a presidential statement, really. They need legally binding rules. In the U.S. system, that means watching the agency that actually writes the rules, that's the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, and watching the Federal Register. That's where official regulatory changes get published. Until there's a formal notice filed there detailing the pause, its conditions, its duration, well, technically that 50% rule could still be enforced. There's a gap, a potentially risky gap, between the political handshake and the actual regulation on the books.
That lack of formal notice is definitely a worry. But then there are the things that weren't just fuzzy, but were, it seems, deliberately kept off the table entirely.
Yes. President Trump himself apparently made clear that the talks did not touch on cross-strait relations, which is, arguably the biggest geopolitical flashpoint between them.
So the core security issue wasn't part of the economic truce.
Not at all. And maybe even more relevant for the global economy right now, the tech confrontation is still very much on. Even while agreeing to this truce, Trump specifically refused to approve the sale of NVIDIA's most advanced AI chips, the Blackwell ones, to China.
Wow. So even in the middle of de-escalation talks, the most cutting-edge tech remains blocked.
Blocked. And it shows you where the real red lines are. They might compromise on soybeans, maybe tweak some tariffs, pause some fees. But the fundamental drive towards technological decoupling, especially in strategic areas like AI, that seems to be proceeding full steam ahead.
And didn't he also sort of reframe the issue, saying that access to other, maybe less advanced chips should be worked out between China and NVIDIA directly, with the U.S. government just acting as a referee?
Yeah, that referee comment was interesting. But if the U.S. is still the one deciding which chips can't be sold, the most important ones, how much of a referee are they really? It feels more like they're still very much dictating the terms of play in the high-tech arena.
It really undermines the idea of a comprehensive de-escalation, doesn't it? If the most critical area of competition is essentially cordoned off from the truce.
It absolutely does. The truce seems confined to specific economic lanes, agriculture, rare earths, some tariffs. But step into the lane marked strategic tech competition, AI dominance, industrial policy.
Yeah.
And the gloves are still very much off.
And TikTok, that high-profile issue.
Also not resolved. Trump didn't bring up the future of its U.S. operations or that whole forced sale ownership transfer idea. China's Ministry of Commerce just vaguely said talks would continue. So another major irritant kicked down the road, not solved by this deal.
So this really feeds the criticism, then, that the deal was more about grabbing some easy, visible win soybeans, a pause on tariffs, rather than tackling the really hard structural stuff.
Like industrial policy.
Yeah, because China isn't exactly backing down on its own tech ambitions, is it?
Not at all. In fact, around the same time as these truce talks, Chinese authorities were apparently reaffirming their goals to boost advanced manufacturing, push for technological self-sufficiency. There's a big policy meeting in October about it.
So they're agreeing to a temporary ceasefire on one front, while signaling they intend to compete even harder on another.
That's precisely the dynamic, which makes this truce feel very fragile, just a temporary marker.
And that leads us right into the next big concern, the risk that this truce doesn't hold, or that we're just stuck in a cycle of perpetual instability now.
Yeah, the instability risk feels almost built in now, by design almost. And a big part of that comes from Trump's suggestion, reportedly made public, that this deal might need to be renegotiated every year.
Annually. Okay, hold on. What does that actually mean for businesses trying to operate in this environment? A rolling one-year deal.
It's incredibly disruptive for any kind of long-term planning. Think about major capital expenditure, building a new factory, setting up a complex supply chain. Those aren't one-year decisions. They often have 5, 10, even 15-year horizons. If you're a company and you know that in 11 months, those tariffs could suddenly jump back up from 47% to 57%, or that rare earth supplies might get choked off again, How can you possibly commit billions of dollars to a project?
You can't, really. Or you'd have to build in massive contingency costs.
Exactly. This kind of engineered uncertainty, this annual review threat, it basically guarantees that companies will continue looking for ways to diversify away from relying too heavily on this specific trade relationship. The truce might slow that diversification down for a year, but it doesn't stop the underlying pressure.
And we also have to consider the track record here, right? Implementation risk. We've seen deals before.
We have. The big one was the 2020 trade deal. China committed then to buy something like $200 billion extra in U.S. goods and services over 2 years.
And they didn't meet those targets.
They didn't. Now, they largely blamed the pandemic, which certainly had an impact. But the fact remains the commitment wasn't fulfilled. And that history inevitably hangs over this new agreement. Can we be sure the commitments made this time will be fully implemented?
Especially when the details might still be fuzzy, even between the negotiators.
That's another layer of risk. Reports suggest that the lead negotiators, Scott Bessent for the U.S., Vice Premier He Lifeng for China, have actually struggled in past rounds to get on the same page about what exactly they agreed on. Given the pressure cooker environment of that airbase meeting and the fact they're both relatively new to leading these massive, complex talks, it seems plausible that there's still significant room for misunderstandings or different interpretations of the fine print later on. We shouldn't just assume perfect alignment.
Okay, so we have ambiguity, annual renegotiation threats, implementation risk, and all of this is happening while the geopolitical background noise is getting louder, not quieter.
That's the crucial context. This trade truce isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening alongside ongoing friction over tech security. Think cyber incidents, continued military posturing in places like the South China Sea, and perhaps most starkly, right before this meeting aimed at de-escalation, President Trump ordered the U.S. to start preparations for nuclear weapons testing on an equal basis with Russia and China.
That kind of rhetoric, that kind of action, it surely must impact how the economic signals are received.
Absolutely. It risks swamping the economic signaling entirely. If you're that CEO making a 10-year investment decision, news about nuclear testing capabilities or rising tensions in the South China Sea, that's going to weigh much more heavily on your risk assessment, on your willingness to embrace uncertainty, than a temporary pause on port fees will reassure you. The geopolitics can easily undermine the trade truce.
Right. So, pulling this together for listeners trying to navigate this, what's a practical takeaway? What should people be watching closely over the next, say, month or two?
Okay, first practical point. Try to tune out some of the day-to-day political noise and focus on the hard data in the supply chain itself. Are things actually moving? Specifically, if the rare earth and magnet flows genuinely start moving more smoothly, you should see timelines easing up in sectors like automotive, EVs, defense. But don't just assume it's happening. Watch the real indicators. Customs, clearance times, are permits being issued faster, are goods getting stuck, or are they flowing? That's the ground truth.
And on the policy side, watching for those official documents.
Exactly. Treat this whole thing, for now, primarily as a political commitment carrying significant implementation risk. The key is to watch for the official written confirmations. On the U.S. side, as we said, keep an eye on the Federal Register for that formal notice about pausing the 50% affiliates rule for export controls. On the Chinese side, look for actual guidance from their Ministry of Commerce, MOFTOM, that puts the rare earth export pause into operational effect. Until you see those official papers, you have to assume the risk profile hasn't fundamentally changed because it's still closer to a handshake deal than codified policy.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. The big picture seems to be, this South Korea meeting did achieve something important. It created a one-year détente. It definitely lowered the immediate heat on some critical flashpoints, rare earths, tariffs.
Yes, absolutely. It took some of the most immediate, potentially catastrophic risks off the table for about 12 months, reduce that near-term tail risk. But it didn't really dismantle the underlying structure of conflict. That high baseline of tariffs is still there. The threat of annual renegotiation hangs over everything, embedding uncertainty. And that core clash over technology, over industrial strategy, that's still raging.
So we've moved from maybe outright unmanaged conflict towards managed friction.
That feels like the right description. Managed friction. It's less chaotic, perhaps, but still fundamentally adversarial. And that brings us to the final thought, really. Okay, the deal calmed markets, which was needed. But if you have both sides agreeing to this economic truce while simultaneously ramping up rhetoric on nuclear testing onto tech self-reliance, how long before a spark in a totally different area The South China Sea, maybe a cyber incident, completely upends this fragile trade peace. Real, stable ground still feels a long way off. This truce perhaps just bought everyone a year to prepare for whatever comes next.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.